Welcome to a second season of Crushing Capitalism. In this issue, we discuss the Federal Reserve policies and their implications for U.S.-China relations and the working class. You may have noticed in recent news that the Federal Reserve, under the leadership of Ben Bernanke, has decided to purchase U.S. Treasury bills to help the economy. Now, what are these Treasury bills? They're basically bonds issued by the government, which means they are IOUs. If you give the government your money now, it promises to pay you back with interest. Now, why would the Federal Reserve want to buy treasuries? The logic, at least as explained to us by none other than Ben Bernanke, is to stimulate the economy and create more jobs, knowing that right now the unemployment rate is a major drag to the economy. By buying treasuries, you create a greater demand for these things. And whenever something is in greater demand, its price goes up. In this case, when the price of a bond or a treasury bill goes up, the interest that it pays, given how these things are designed, goes down. So, the more it costs to buy a treasury bill, the less interest it's going to pay. And then, according to the Federal Reserve, since the interest rates will be kept at near zero, it will be cheaper for capitalists to borrow and invest in various economic activities, hopefully generating more jobs. Now, the problem with this is that, according to the Federal Reserve itself, at best, these policies would reduce the unemployment rate, which is the stated goal, by about half a percentage point, which translates roughly into 700,000 jobs or so, and over 2 years. But to put it in perspective, new unemployment applications every single month have been coming in at more than 400,000 new applicants, with some exceptions every now and then. So then, what is the real goal of these Federal Reserve policies? One of these real goals, but not the primary goal, is to bolster the stock market. In fact, even Ben Bernanke and other people affiliated with the Federal Reserve had stated so in the past. So how is it that the Federal Reserve is inflating the stock market? By keeping interest rates at near zero, it makes it less attractive for people to deposit their money in savings accounts or to purchase bonds in general. Instead, they're going to look over to the stock market and prefer to purchase stocks that promise to offer a higher yield than, let's say, the savings account, which means you are now generating greater demand for these stocks that pay the higher yield. Therefore, the stock market tends to rise. Now, this in of itself is quite artificial, and it's absolutely no guarantee that this inflated stock market is not going to crash yet again. But that's a separate issue. In terms of who is benefiting from this, it's pretty obvious. It's the wealthy. Why? Because although the average American is brainwashed to think that stock ownership in America is very broad, they don't realize that, yes, a lot of people may have some ownership of stocks, primarily because of their retirement accounts, their 401ks if they still have them, and so forth. As a whole, workers in America own very little of the stock market itself, even though they participate. To give you an idea, the bottom 80% of Americans altogether own roughly about 15.5% of all the stock, whereas the richest 20% of Americans own something like 84 to 85% of all the stock, and the richest 1% by itself owns close to 34%. So when Ben Bernanke is inflating the stock market, he's really helping the rich. He's not helping you and me. But then what is the true goal, the primary objective of these Federal Reserve policies? The primary objective has to do with China. The Chinese government routinely intervenes in currency markets to keep its own currency low and the American dollar high. Why? Because when the Chinese money has low value, its currency is cheap, it allows China to export to other countries. For example, as an American, my dollar can buy a lot more Chinese product when my dollar is strong compared to the Chinese currency. And for the United States, this is unfair. It's an unfair trade advantage, and again, given the rules of the system they created, it is an unfair advantage. And they complained for a long time for China to actively increase the value of its currency, and the Chinese have been stonewalling the world in essence and really haven't moved on this, at least not in a meaningful way. Nor do they intend to, because it's not in their national interest, despite the propaganda of Tim Geithner when he was lecturing the Chinese. As a result, the United States, and now comes the Federal Reserve, have decided to increase the value of the Chinese currency in an indirect way. How is this done? When the Federal Reserve buys these treasuries, technically, it may or may not be called printing money. In fact, the Federal Reserve has refused to call this a form of printing money. But in reality, it is a form of printing money. So when we are printing money, as most people know, what we are doing in essence is creating a bigger supply of this thing called the dollar. And when something is in abundance, people are not going to want to pay too much for it. They can get it from anywhere. So if there's a lot of dollars circulating in the world because the Fed is printing dollars, then the value of the dollar goes down, which means what? Now, indirectly, because the value of the dollar went down, you're making the Chinese currency more expensive. So now Americans can be more competitive in exporting their products, say, to China. And that is the primary objective here of the Federal Reserve policies, not really to help the economy in terms of unemployment and the working poor. But there's yet another side benefit to this policy in terms of what it does to China. China is in a very difficult relationship with the United States. It understands that it would probably be better off if it didn't use US dollars, but it's too late. It already holds US dollars. And now all these treasury bills that are sitting in Chinese banks are going to start losing value. Why? These treasury bills that China buys from the United States are denominated in, of course, US dollars. And if the US dollar becomes cheap, in essence, the value of these treasuries goes down. As far as the working class is concerned, this is going to have some very interesting consequences. As we already explained, the unemployment rate is not going to really budge just because Bernanke is buying these treasury bills. But what Bernanke and the rest of them may or may not be aware of is that when you are keeping interest rates at near zero, you are re-inflating or trying to re-inflate the economy, which, if you think about it, is not that different from what his predecessor, Greenspan, was doing, which got us into this mess in the first place. Greenspan kept interest rates at near zero, and everybody who could lend money would give it to anyone, even if they had no way of paying it back, and as a result, we see the housing collapse of 2008 and everything else that followed. Secondly, as far as the working class is concerned, when Ben Bernanke is lowering the value of the dollar, he's also making the things that you and I buy more expensive. What they really don't explain to you is that most commodities, whether this is food, whether this is energy like oil, are traded internationally in US dollars, meaning they're denominated in US dollars. Now, the value of a barrel of oil is not necessarily going to change if nothing else happens around the world. But when the US government lowers the value of the dollar, then those who sell, let's say, a barrel of oil are going to request more dollars than before just to represent the real value of the oil that did not change compared to the cheapening dollar that we use to value the barrel of oil. And as I said, this is also true of food. A simple way to understand this is as follows. When the value of the dollar goes down, the value, or I should say the purchasing price of food and commodities goes up. And that can have tremendous consequences for the poor people around the world whose income primarily goes toward food, and now they cannot even buy that little food that they used to. But it also means that things become more expensive in the United States. notice that in the news, they stopped talking about the $3 a gallon gas that we're witnessing. So why are food and gas getting more expensive? Because of a cheap dollar. But if we intended to help the economy in the first place with these policies, what's going to happen if things are not costing more, unemployment is really not going to change, and worse, the people who do have jobs are not going to be able to get cost of living adjustments. Meaning what? Meaning that when the dollar is cheap, another way of looking at it is as if it's causing inflation. In fact, rising prices of commodities is the definition of inflation, or at least a basic way of looking at it. So now we have prices going up, that's inflation, but workers, because their unions have been broken, because America has all these anti-labor laws, because people simply are terrified to speak up, are not going to get any increases, or at least meaningful increases, in their incomes. So now you combine stagnant incomes, if not reduced incomes, with even higher prices of the things that people like you and buy every day, and then you can understand why aggregate demand is going to fall even more than before, meaning that people will be able to buy even less, which makes things even worse for our economy. But in terms of U.S.-Chinese relations, there is much more to be concerned about. If we were to ask Thucydides, what are the real reasons for global wars, whether it was World War I or World War II, he would tell us that it was a rising power challenging one that was declining, and maybe combined with bad economic times, which led to policies amongst nations such as beggar thy neighbor currency devaluations. This means that everybody was trying to export their way into prosperity by cheapening the value of their own currency compared to the guy next door. But eventually, this became an economic war where you had repeated devaluations that in turn escalated into trade wars and eventually the hot wars. And currently we are seeing, as I have presented in this issue, the United States and China bickering with each other and engaging in currency wars. We also have seen in the news the US and China engaging in trade wars, although not of a major magnitude. As a result, we may be seeing yet another world war, or at the very least, a hegemonic struggle, which may not be that far off now, as we have seen US and China challenge each other militarily when it comes to, let's say, the South China Sea and other areas. Then the question becomes, what is going to happen? What's going to happen with this wild capitalism and the stagnation that it creates in all the Western economies, coupled with its impact on other nations such as the Chinese? We may be living, as the Chinese say, in interesting times. However, as they would swiftly remind us, that's also a curse. So, my friends, hold on to the seats of your pants, because it looks like we're in for another wild ride.
Take a